is Juliana Bedoya. I was born in Colombia, in the Andes, Colombian Andes, that is in Bogota. That is high up, 3,000 meters elevation above sea level. And I grew up in this kind of mountain region, but in a very large city, like think Mexico City, something really oversized, like almost 30 million population, which is the population almost of Canada or something like that, but only for one city. So I grew up in a very urban environment, but always with the mountains behind me. And that there's actually something that I recently acknowledged, and is that in Colombia, because you might know there's conflict, violence, and all these things, accessing natural spaces is not as easy as doing it here. Here you might fear bears or other things, but there you fear different things that are sometimes you might get robbed or you might get, kidnapped even in some instances. So it's kind of a rough reality to acknowledge, but actually it's a reality that when I moved to Canada, I started to actually explore the natural world in a different way, with more freedom. And I think that is what really allowed me to access the knowledge of plants and the gifts of plants in a different way. Of course, there's stepping stones to get to that place, but I just want to refer to that reality, just so you understand my context and where I come from. So I was born there, grew up there, and for a time I'm a visual artist, went to university, did different studies in sculpture installation, and that's where I come from sculpture, and then I worked as a community engaged artist, and further that here when I immigrated to Canada. But working there in kind of my early 20s, I was an outdoor instructor, and I accessed natural places from a recreational point of view, and where you really access the natural world more as a backdrop and as a container of your own experience, rather than a relational approach to the natural world where you're actually acknowledging living beings that are actually containing your experience, but you're relating to it in a different way. So that was more kind of recreational, adventure focus, right? Nature is my kind of device to access, to maximize my experience, right? That travel across Central and South America doing that. But then when I immigrated to Canada, this is a different story. After some years in doing community engaged work, I started taking courses, but really the game changer was a day when I attended a witness ceremony at the Roundhouse Community Center. This is years ago, and that really changed my heart actually in a different way, and my lens to see the natural world. It was a long witness ceremony, but really didn't have anything to do with any of art creating or anything like that. It had more to do with actual ceremony and actual seeing really things with a different lens, more at the intersection of spirituality and also relational approach, right? And also understanding the principles of indigenous peoples, right? I also kind of want to backtrack a little bit. Working as a community engaged artist, I also worked in cultural arts and cultural programming, and my connection to West Vancouver is really interesting because I used to be the community arts supervisor at the Fair Living Gallery. If you're from West Van, that got just renovated. Are you from West Van, by the way? No? Some? Okay.
Everyone knows the Fair.
Yeah, the Fair Living Gallery is this beautiful heritage building, and I was in that position for about 3 years, and the pandemic hit. So we all kind of lost our jobs, as you might know, or got paused, and then that really changed the course. Another thing that really changed kind of the way I related to art making was my mentor and friend Sharon Callis and her practice. Do you know Sharon? So Sharon was the first person, I actually before the Fair Living Gallery worked in an arts programming capacity, so I knew Sharon from an arts programming capacity, kind of engaging her to deliver arts programming. And then I attended one of her events, community events, and she was teaching how to make rope out of daily leaves. That one teaching transformed my relationship to art making. Because by then, she showed me how to really work with even garden trimmings that would go to the green bin otherwise, right? And the moment I started to make rope and got kind of in that zone, something happened internally. I kind of now, seeing it retrospectively, see it as my kind of ancestral DNA awoke. It's kind of like the awakening of like, I was supposed to be doing this forever, but I wasn't doing it. And someone just showed me a path. My body felt engaged, my mind, my heart, everything felt engaged in one action that didn't need division of like, you know, when you feel compartmentalized and your brain is somewhere and your body somewhere else. It's kind of our daily thing in kind of Western culture somehow. This felt true to me, and really was kind of giving me back my humanity in a way, if I can explain that somehow. So from that was the starting point to now opening a world of possibilities with working with plants, with garden trims, with foodways, with invasives, etc., etc. And from then on, I started working with different mentors, indigenous and non-indigenous, right? And also YouTube University and all the things, right, that are accessible to us these days, books, etc., right? A plethora of how do you pronounce that word? Of many avenues that knowledge gets communicated. So that's me, Juliana. And well, now after the pandemic, we moved to the island as a family. I have 2 kids that were born here in Canada. And with my husband, we started a new life a year and a half ago, almost. And anyway, that's pretty much in a nutshell me. I really wanted to start with positioning the relational aspect to plants, because to me that actually is more important than even the art making, so to speak. Why? Because we come from a heritage of extractivist mindset, right? Of functionality, of really seeing things for what they can do, their performance, and we actually see ourselves in with the same lens, right? Always measuring capacity, performance, etc., but we don't stop to just be, right? Just be and acknowledge, and just don't expect deliverable from people, from things, from plants, right? That's why I really wanted to start with that and hand out a little pocket card that I created with the Honorable Harvest. And this teaching comes from the book, one of my most favorite books, called Breaking Sweetgrass. The author, Robin Wall Kimmerer, put language to words that were practiced in her own Potawatomi culture. How that is a foundation for the work we do, or for the work I want to do and invite you to do. Of course, you can keep accessing plants whatever way you want, but this is an invitation for you to kind of reframe and also start building relationships with those plants that we're asking their gifts from, right? In this particular case, their color. Another source, really great, is called also Reciprocal Foraging. Not the Honorable Harvest, but the principles are the same. Start with like acknowledging, introducing ourselves to the plants, right? That sounds sometimes for some people like crazy. You talk to plants? What are you talking about? You know? But in a way, like I have experienced it from my personal kind of journey with plants, it really makes a whole difference. They talk about like even whatever you can fit in a handful, like in your hands, but they even say with one hand actually. You know, so of course it depends what you're harvesting. If you're growing your own things, if it's for feeding or for, you know, of course it's kind of making sense. But if you're foraging and not necessarily growing from seed, I think that attitude of like just a little bit, and especially if you're experimenting with color, handful is enough. Work with what's abundant is the best way to describe it. Another thing is, well, we talked about this idea of kinship when asking for the gifts that plants are going to give us, being that their food, their shelter, their fiber, their color, you know. And one important thing, and that's why I always refer to what in my organization is called Plants Are Teachers, but I always refer to art, ecology, and community. Community is an important thing because humans on this planet also build relationships with place, and if we build relationship with humans and plants, then the whole kind of equation works out. And again, experiment with all parts of the plant, knowing that color changes considerably depending on the season. There's higher tannins later in the season than earlier in the season. So that also will change your color extraction. And also, like sometimes you think certain plants might not carry color, but they will give you surprises. Also, there's surprises with plants that probably they look purple, but the ultimate, like the resulting ink might turn green or might turn other color. So experimentation is fascinating with plants. Also, it's not written here, but some plants are toxic, so that's kind of like the first thing that you should do your research. Well, it's actually written here, like do your research. Try to, like right now we have access to so much information and it's so easy to just Google a plant and see, is it toxic, is it not? Always try to kind of set up your kitchen in the outdoors or like a huge vent kind of absorbing all that, okay? There's a lot of like poisonous things here, same as like if you were working with commercial paint, like you would never eat a tube of acrylic paint, right? So it's kind of part of the norms is always dedicate your equipment to dye or art making and never use it for food. And our goal for today is to make ink out of the bark of Mahonia. It's from the barberries family. If you're aware of like the barberries plant, like in that family, they usually have a very pigmented inner bark. One other thing that is important to consider is that this is living color, so don't get attached to a color. And you look at it like next day and the color is like, goodbye! Totally fugitive. But it's good to see it, you know, maybe photograph it once it's alive like that. And then ephemeral. Okay, you're okay with that. Let go, right? We're so used in our culture to synthetic colors, you know, that are so homogeneous and permanent that it's hard for us to kind of go back to, you know, how nature talks, which is in a different language. When ink was discovered, paint was discovered first, right? Like if you see the hands with the red pigment on their caves, you know, it's like that. Humans have made paint, but ink is almost kind of a way newer discovery actually. And when ink was invented, it also was paired up with the language and the transmission of language in written like knowledge, right? And also ink became the medium to communicate spiritual knowledge as well through scripture, right? There's a beautiful kind of connection of ink and the truthfulness of the gestural ink, right? As opposed to the paint. When you see paint is more kind of a layered, it's more kind of, it has a different, it communicates the idea differently than ink. Ink has some certain sincerity and truthfulness to what it is. And that relationship to spirituality to me is really fascinating, right? So what he says is that he calls his experiments like tests because he wants to be free and let ink do what it does, right? So you're invited to let ink do what it does. No pressure to having to, you know, make anything particularly. Just let the ink and just be curious about what happens if you put a drop of iron or like if you put a little bit of this or that or nothing at all. But now I'm gonna actually filter because I see there's some sediment from the bark, like super tiny pieces. So I'm gonna actually filter with this paper filter again, okay? Just so you know. And after that, I'm gonna add the last remaining ingredients, the drops of clove oil and all that. going to talk about something called a lake. I don't know if you've ever heard the term a lake pigment. Have you ever? Never ever?
How do you spell it?
Like a lake.
L-A-K-E.
Which is a term that actually, it's super fascinating, the history of the term, because it comes from originally from lac, which is the name of an insect, where lacquer comes from. And this insect produced ink pigment back in India, which actually is a word that I think in Sanskrit, that is pronounced like similar to lac, then lacquer, lake, it comes from that origin. And what it is actually a chemical process that is ancient as well, which is fascinating that we're resurrecting all this chemistry, and like this is how medieval people used to make paints, right? Out of botanical origin, because lakes can only be created with organic matter. You cannot make a lake with a mineral pigment, which also is another source of color historically. Like there's a lot of mineral sourced pigments, like from clays, from stones like lapis lazuli, for example. It's a beautiful blue that was extremely expensive. Like if you read some of the books that we put out there for your bibliography, there's really this cool story about how the commissions for portraits in medieval times and Renaissance, some artists wouldn't have the money to pay for the pigments, and they would ask the actual commissioner to pay for the pigments and buy them themselves, and they would be so apprehensive of the use of the color because it was so extremely expensive, like say a blue or a red, that they would say, and this pigment is for the dress of so and so, because that was also a symbol of status if they would use the color for a particular medieval painting of a portrait of someone, right? That was also kind of, if we talk about color in representational aspects, right, of painting, but if we talk about color in actual wearing the color, also it was forbidden for certain classes, social classes, to wear a particular color because it was only royalty, not only who could wear these colors, but also who could pay for them, right? Because certain colors are extremely expensive, even to this day, right? And it is so fascinating, the history of color, and how when it was synthesized and accessible to the masses, then the whole kind of status of color changed all of a sudden, right? And it was a red color that also originally came from the root of matter, the madder root. This root I grew on the island. This is the color of Rubia tinctoria, is the name of this beautiful plant that historically has such an importance, because all the potent reds in history came from the Rubia tinctoria, which is this root. If you read, it's fascinating because Rubia tinctoria was the pigment known in the world for reds until they discovered, quote unquote, the Americas, and then cochineal, which is the insect that we already spoke about, became accessible, and then that was a game changer, because anyway, there's a lot of historical kind of accounts of like how color transformed history, and then royalty would prefer the cochineal because it was more potent, and there would have been kind of battles in the ocean for like pirates kind of trying to steal the cochineal coming from Mexico. That's where it came from. So it's really fascinating, the history of these pigments. But let's go back to the idea of a lake, or lac, or lake. I would say lake is now how it's known, a lake pigment. So what happens is that instead of creating an ink, which is in liquid form, you can actually get rid of the water and make the color not hydrosoluble, and turn it into a watercolor by precipitating the organic matter. And how that happens in the chemistry of it is that you have this liquid is suspended here, like the pigment is suspended in water, right? Right now, this is lungwort. I double boiled it, so not direct heat, but double boil it. All these pigments here I created this way, right? With a double boiled system. Basically, it's just a pot with a mason jar inside and let it simmer, right? For an hour or two, depending, as you can see, the color really extracting is when you can turn it off. And even sometimes I don't even extract the color, but do solar dye for textiles. So I can actually put pieces of fabric that are pre-mordanted or not, depending on if it's a protein fiber or a cellulose fiber. Dip it in the pigment or in the dye bath, and take the color from it. Okay, so we're using the metallic salt, which is the alum, right? The aluminum salt, and we're using soda ash. And it's usually 1 part of soda ash for 2 parts of alum, whatever the measurement you use. In our case, we're gonna start with 1 gram. If it's not enough, double it, 2 grams. And you can see the precipitate to create. It's honestly like a chemistry lab, and you're seeing the color being from hydrosoluble into a non-hydrosoluble, right? It's fascinating. And then you filter that, and that's why I wanted to display all these filters, which is kind of process. What I'm showing you is how all these colors were filtered. If you come closer, you can see, oh, there's goldenrod and iron in the mix here. And then I filtered it. And this powder is what we are going to grind with a medium, which is our watercolor medium, that you have the recipe of, that has honey and glycerin and all these components. We're gonna use a glass muller, which is an ancient instrument also to grind matter from mineral or organic origin into a micro particles to make it more suitable for paint. So just so you know, this was double boiled maybe for an hour and a half on the stovetop with a pot full of water, the jar inside, and all these jars were there kind of boiling to extract the color that is right there. So this is what I'm doing, just taking as much as I can, and look, all the color is really in the water now. Okay, and now this can also go here. Okay, so now let's put this back in the jar. We're gonna add our alum, right? We're gonna, it's supposed to be clean, but it's not that clean. We're gonna mix it all there. And now we're gonna add our soda ash into the precipitate. Let's see what happens. So, as you can see, I don't know if you can tell what's happening there. Not only turn green, so it modified the color of the purple cosmos, but it's also, do you see that it's actually kind of becoming precipitating? Okay? So that's what's happening in there. So I feel like we should probably add another part just to precipitate and separate it more of the same measuring that we just did. So pour the alum first. Thank you so much. Do you see that bubbling, kind of? Then let's add a little bit of the soda ash. You see what's happening in there? It completely separated. So that separation, that's the pigment right there. And once you filter this, which is what we're going to do next, we're going to let it kind of separate even more. And once we do that, we're going to strain it here with one of these coffee filters. Use white just so you can see the color, but you can use any coffee filter or any good filtering system that you have access to. You can just use that, and this is your dry pigment. Sometimes if it's this weather, it takes really over like 1 day or 2 to dry up for you to be able to turn that into a watercolor pigment, and that's what we're doing next. But if it's cold, it takes longer, right? Or if you put it next to the heating system, it really accelerates the drying of your filters, right? Okay, so now we have this beautiful separation. We're gonna leave it aside because we're gonna do this in a moment. But imagine, fast forward in our cooking show, you know when they pass the plate and it's already cooked? That's what we're doing. This is what happened overnight. We filtered our precipitate, and now we're going to turn it into a watercolor, usable watercolor pigment. So this is what we do. Come to your grinder, which is here, that you bought at the not at the dollar store, at the thrift store, right? Or an old grinder that someone gave you. We can just kind of put hot now, not in use. And I love doing it here because it's really homogeneous, but in ancient times, people would do it on a mortar like that for a long extended period of time, so you have some uniformity. If you don't have access to electricity, which chances are you're in the outdoors and you're doing this or something, just use your mortar, right? That could be a first step in the process, is actually pre-grinding this and then putting it in the actual, what's the word for that? Yeah, grinding it in the mortar and pestle and then passing it to your actual grinder. But in this case, for the purpose of time, because I really want you to see this whole process, we're gonna grind it here and cover it and then just, so hold on, because this is the part when it's good to have a mask, because there's a whole kind of storm happening inside the grinder. So sometimes I occupy myself with doing something else, so I leave that storm to kind of, if I open it right now, look what's happening here. Do you see that? So all your pigment is kind of escaping. So, excuse me for that. Thank goodness we're outside. I'm gonna let that kind of settle. So now that I ground my pigment here, I usually pack them in these tiny bottles that are also very cute. And I use a funnel for that. Okay. So that's what you do with your pigment. This is one step of the process. That's if you want to collect your pigment and save it for later use, right? But in this case, we actually want to turn it into watercolor paint. And for that, I bought this piece of glass at a glass store that had sandblasted glass. That's how you ask for it, because the sandblasting adds grind to what you're going to do. And this I bought online as a glass muller. That's what it's called, a glass muller. They also have the ones that have a bigger handle that are so great to work with, but they cost a little bit more. So I only have like the cheaper version. You could also use the weights for fermentation that look like this too, and if they're completely flat, they work. What you do is you pour down a little bit of the pigment. For these, I'm not measuring, I'm just eyeballing, okay? Because it's more about how you feel the pigment is. Some people are super technical about measurements. I'm not, so forgive me for that. If you're the type of person who's super technical, you can do this in a very technical way. I'm more kind of a let's do it and let's just feel it, and you know. The only thing that really has measuring is this substance, and you have the recipe. And there's other things that I really need to measure, like the alum and the soda ash. You really need to measure that, because if you change the ratio, it affects your end result. But these two things are the only two that follow the recipe, right? The other things is more about experimentation. And then we need this medium, the watercolor medium. Making your watercolor medium, and there's a recipe there. So the recipe calls for honey, wintergreen oil or clove oil, a lot of gum arabic, water, and a little bit tiny of glycerin, vegetable glycerin. That's my recipe for the medium that makes your pigment flow, right? Grab a little bit of that medium and put it in there. And for these, I had a painting knife. All the things that I need disappear when I need them. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start mixing the pigment with the medium here. See? What we're going to do now is grab the glass muller, and this is the most satisfying thing to do. And what you're going to do is you're going to start grinding the pigment like this, okay, to the minimal expression of a particle, okay? So grind it, grind it, grind it. This, I think, feels ready to be packed or be
It sounds
actually
different to me.
See?
It doesn't
Yeah.
sound as pretty as when you started.
Yeah, it sounds like soft, right? So this is one you can tell, okay, this is ready to be packed. So what we'll do is we're gonna put a dot of these in this little card and let it dry. And that's gonna be your dot card. Anyway, all these particles are not dissolved, but you know that they can dissolve if you just make the effort to kind of, dilute it here, right?